Alright, let's wrap up our discussion of the ontological argument by looking at our final objection. And this objection comes to us from Immanuel Kant. Kant, K-A-N-T, is a very famous philosopher from the modern period. So he came a bit after Anselm, but this criticism is held up and is still discussed today. So let's see what Kant had to say. And so, just to give you a rough overview, Kant's going to say that premise 3 is false. So, remember, premise 3 is our claim that existence is a great-making property. And so, Anselm thinks that jumping over the line from existing in the understanding to existing in reality is always going to make something greater, right? So, we think of any two objects, well, if it only exists in the understanding, well, then it could be greater. It could also exist in reality. So this is the premise that Kant's going to put the most pressure on. So let's see what he has to actually say. Now, just as a warning, this can be pretty difficult to understand. So if you're having difficulty understanding Kant's objection, please reach out. Please email me, and we can either email back and forth or set up a time to talk through it. But yeah, let's jump into it and see if we can make sense of it. Okay, so the way Kant's going to question premise 3 is he's going to say, well, hey, look, existence isn't a predicate. Right? So when you say something like God exists, you're predicating existence for God. But Kant's going to claim we can't do that because that's going to lead us to have either redundant or contradictory statements. So, in other words, predication assumes the existence of the thing we're applying the predicate to. So think of the following two statements. Tigers exist, dragons do not exist. Now, if Kant's right that existence isn't a predicate, then tigers exist is extremely redundant, and dragons do not exist is contradictory. Because if predication assumes the existence of the thing we're applying the predicate to, then the sentence tigers exist is really just saying, hey, there's these existing tigers, and we're predicating that they exist. Right? So it's redundant to say that existing tigers exist. On the other hand, our claim about dragons not existing would be contradictory, because you'd be saying, hey, these things, dragons that exist, do not exist. Right? So since predication assumes existence, to even apply a predicate of existence or non-existence is nonsense. We'd either be saying existing tigers exist or existing dragons do not exist. Either way, we're either saying something not very interesting with our tiger example or something contradictory with our dragon example. Now, is this true, right? Does predication always assume the existence of the thing we're applying the predicate to? So think of fictional characters, right? So I think a good example comes from the following. We can say something like this. Dr. Dolittle is an animal lover. Here we are predicating something about Dr. Dolittle, right? We're predicating that he is an animal lover. Are we somehow assuming the existence of Dr. Dolittle in doing that, though? Doesn't seem so to me. It seems like we can predicate all sorts of things about our fictional characters or fictional domain of things, right? Without assuming that they exist at the same time. So maybe this example of fictional characters gives us a way out of Kant's objection. But maybe he's right. It's not a knockdown objection, right? Maybe he's right in saying that every time we're talking about existence, we're trying to predicate when we can't do that because we're just going to be saying something that's nonsensical. Okay, so that might be difficult. Hopefully you feel pretty confident, and hopefully you see that if Kant's right that existence is not a predicate, then premise 3 would be false. Right? And you need premise 3 to get to premise 5 and so on. Right? So if he's correct that premise 3 is false, then once again, you're free of the argument's conclusion. You don't have to accept premise 9. Okay, so what are we going to say here? How do we wrap this all up? What are we supposed to conclude at the end of this big discussion? So it seems like here's where we should be at. Premise 2 and premise 3 are both problematic. Premise 2 is problematic because we're not sure whether or not God is more like the angle or the integer. So until we can come to a full understanding here about premise 2 and about what God's powers have to be like, we can't know whether or not God is possible. And so then we can't use this argument either way, right? Essentially, premise 2 has put us in a position where we need to sit back and not make claims about the conclusion. We can just say, hey, until we settle the debate about premise 2, we just have to be agnostic about the worth of this argument. But if somebody, so there's more work to do, right? If somebody can come in and show that God is more like the angle and prove that to us, well, then Anselm's argument works and he can prove the existence of God. Or an atheist or somebody else can come along and show that no, God would really have to be more like the integer, in which case we would see that Anselm's argument fails. So how should you feel? You should feel P2 gives us more work to do, but doesn't give us conclusive evidence either way. Okay, and then a very similar thing can be said about premise 3, right? Because we didn't give too much of a debate right here, but I just want you to know in the literature, there's still a debate going on about whether or not existence is a predicate. So until we can settle that debate, P3 or premise 3 is equally problematic as premise 2, right? We need to settle the debate on premises 1 and 2 before we can see whether or not the argument is successful or has been destroyed. So that's not a bad thing, right? That says, hey, there's more work for us to do here in trying to understand this. But either way, Anselm's given us an ingenious argument. Just by starting with a definition of something, he's pretty close to proving that that thing exists. So I guess time will tell whether or not P2 and P3 can be proven, false or true, either way. So until then, hopefully you see the force of the argument. If you already think that P2 and P3 are true, well, then you might already be rational, right, in accepting that God exists. But P2 and P3 are problematic, so I'm guessing most of us aren't there yet. But yeah, once again, an ingenious logical argument by Anselm with very little wiggle room to get out of, right? Most arguments you can question their reasoning, question a number of different premises. Here we really only have two modes of attack, premise 2 and premise 3. And those can still be defended pretty well, so it's not clear. Okay, so hopefully you had fun thinking about the ontological argument. It's one of the longest standing arguments in philosophy and theology. People still use it to this day, and we'll see other versions of it as the semester goes on. So once again, email me if you're having any trouble understanding any part of this week's lecture. Other than that, I hope you enjoy. Thank you.